In the age of ego, when every rock star was vying for the spotlight, one man fought to stay out of it. Look at the old footage. You'll see a bass player with his back to the crowd, covering his face, standing in the shadows. He wasn't trying to be mysterious. He was being hunted. His name was Bruce Palmer. He was a millionaire, a genius, and a fugitive living in fear. He spent his life running from the law, from his past, and from his own mind. He was the man who breathed life into Buffalo Springfield and paid with his sanity. Our story begins in a place of stark, freezing beauty, far removed from the industrial, beat-driven streets of Liverpool, England, where the Beatles were being forged in the post-war rubble. Bruce Palmer was born in a quiet maritime doppelganger known as Liverpool, Nova Scotia, Canada, on September 9, 1946. From his very first breath, his life was marked by a subtle geographical irony that seemed to dictate his destiny as a figure existing on the periphery of greatness. He was born in the wrong Liverpool, on the edge of the continent, looking out at a gray, indifferent ocean rather than the center of the cultural universe. This sense of being adjacent to history, of being a shadow of a more famous name, would become the recurring melody of his existence. His family was not musical royalty, but working-class stoic people of the Maritimes who were built to endure the cold and the silence of the coast. But the quiet of Nova Scotia was not destined to hold him, and the family moved to Toronto, the sprawling industrial engine of Canada. In the 1950s and early 60s, Toronto was known as Toronto the Good, a city of rigid lines, closed Sundays, and a polite society that frowned upon excess. However, underneath the stiff surface, in the damp basements and the underground dance halls, a new, dangerous energy was bubbling up from the youth. Bruce was a quiet child, described by witnesses from his youth not as shy, but as watchful, possessing the specific, unnerving intensity of a child who sees too much. While other boys were clamoring for attention and shouting to be heard above the noise, Bruce was listening to the spaces between the sounds. Most children, when they pick up an instrument, want the glory of the guitar solo or the thunder of the drums to make themselves the center of attention. They want the spotlight to validate their existence, but Bruce Palmer picked up the bass, an instrument that demands servitude. We have to pause and analyze the psychology of the bass player, because the bass is a paradoxical instrument that serves as the bridge between rhythm and melody. It is the glue that holds the chaotic universe of a song together, requiring the player to accept a role of absolute power with zero glory. To play the bass is to accept that you are the foundation. If you stop, the floor falls out, and if you make a mistake, the entire structure collapses. For young Bruce Palmer, the bass was a shield that allowed him to be on stage without having to engage with the audience. It was the perfect hiding place for a brilliant observer, allowing him to control the room's energy from the shadows without anyone realizing he was the one pulling the strings. But Bruce wasn't just playing along to the radio or mimicking the safe white pop songs of the day. He did something that was almost unheard of for a white teenager in 1960s Toronto. He rejected the mainstream and looked toward the forbidden sounds of R&B. By his late teens, Palmer had infiltrated a world that was supposed to be closed to him, joining a band called the Spectres, which was fronted by Billy Clarkson. This is a crucial detail because the Spectres were an all-black R&B band in a time when racial lines in music were still thick and impermeable. For a white kid to be accepted into a serious working black R&B band, he couldn't just be good or technically proficient. He had to be undeniable. He had to have the pocket, that elusive sense of timing that cannot be taught in a classroom but must be felt in the gut. This was Palmer's true university, where he learned the intricate, sweating, complex syncopation of Motown, Stax, and soul music. He learned that the bass isn't just a note on a page. It is a feeling, a physical force that moves bodies on a dance floor. He learned to play behind the beat, dragging the rhythm just enough to make it sexy, lazy, and dangerous. This period forged his identity as an outsider, the white kid in the black band, the blonde boy in the soul club who didn't look like he belonged. He learned early on that he didn't fit in anywhere, so he decided to become a musical chameleon who could fit in everywhere. He moved from the Spectres to Jack London and the Sparrows, a band that was heavy, gritty, and loud, laying the groundwork for what would become heavy metal. But destiny had a bigger, darker design for Bruce Palmer, leading him toward a collision with two men who represented the twin poles of his own fractured psyche. The year was 1965, and the place was Yorkville, Toronto's answer to Greenwich Village, a bohemian enclave of coffee houses, poetry, and marijuana smoke. Out of this scene emerged a supergroup that history has almost forgotten, a band with a lineup so improbable it sounds like fiction, the Birds. On vocals was Ricky James Matthews, an American draft dodger on the run from the U.S. Navy, radiating pure, chaotic sexual charisma. On guitar was Neil Young, a fragile, eccentric folkie from Winnipeg who played with a volume and intensity that bordered on violence. Anchoring them both was Bruce Palmer, the glue that held the funk and the folk together in a volatile, dangerous union. The Birds were electric, a fusion of rock, folk, and R&B that simply didn't exist yet. In the music world, they were the missing link in rock history, a band that was dangerous, loud, and undeniably destined to be the biggest act on the planet. The buzz was deafening, reaching all the way from the freezing streets of Toronto to the Motor City heat of Detroit. It reached the ears of Berry Gordy and the Golden Tower of Motown, the most important record label in America. This is the moment, the inciting incident of the tragedy, where the Birds became a historical anomaly, an interracial rock band signing a major deal with Motown. Imagine the validation for Bruce Palmer, the kid who cut his teeth playing in black R&B clubs, now signed to the greatest soul label on earth. They were given the keys to the kingdom, recording tracks in Detroit that crackled with potential and sounded like the future of music. The single, "It's My Time," was pressed, the promotional machine was revving up, and the suits were measured for the album cover. The fame was not just a possibility, it was a mathematical certainty that seemed written in the stars. But then, the universe played its cruelest joke, proving that real life is far more brutal than art. Their manager, a man with sticky fingers and bad intentions, had been misappropriating the band's advance money. The band fired him, but in a petty, vindictive act of revenge, the manager made a phone call to the American authorities. He told them exactly where they could find the deserter, Ricky James Matthews, effectively signing the band's death warrant. The police descended on the studio in a raid, dragging Rick James away in handcuffs to a naval brig to face charges for deserting the Vietnam War. In a heartbeat, in the time it takes to snap a bass string, it was all over and the dream evaporated into thin air. Motown shelved the album, locking the master tapes in a vault where they would gather dust for decades, effectively ending the band's career before it began. We have to stop here and perform a psychological autopsy on this specific moment, because this was not just a bad break for Bruce Palmer. It was a trauma. It was the moment he realized that talent, hard work, and genius didn't matter in the face of bad luck. He realized that you could be the best bass player in the world signed to Motown and on the verge of immortality, and it could all be taken away because of someone else's mistake. This moment broke something in him, confirming the dark suspicion that had always lurked in the back of his mind. Success is a lie. It taught him that security is an illusion and that the rug will always be pulled out from under you, just when you feel safe. From this point forward, Bruce Palmer would never truly trust success again, treating it with a detached, stoned indifference to protect himself from pain. The Minor Birds were dead, Rick James was in prison, and the Motown dream was a smoking ruin. Bruce Palmer and Neil Young were left standing in the wreckage in Toronto, broke, humiliated, and illegal in the eyes of the U.S. music industry. Most men would have quit, gone back to school, or found a sensible job in a factory to pay the bills. But Neil Young had a fire in his belly that bordered on madness, and Bruce Palmer had absolutely nothing left to lose. Neil turned to Bruce and said, "We're going to Los Angeles," a plan that sounded as impossible as flying to the moon. They sold everything they owned, the guitars, the amps, and the furniture of their former lives, to scrape together enough cash to buy a car. It wasn't a convertible, it wasn't a van, and it wasn't a sports car. It was a 1953 Pontiac hearse. Literature couldn't write a symbol this heavy. Two young men, their dreams of Motown glory dead and buried, literally bought a vehicle designed to carry the dead. They loaded their few remaining possessions into the back, placing their amplifiers where the coffins were supposed to go, and nicknamed the car Mort. This was the vessel of their rebirth, carrying two ghosts across the border from the gray reality of Canada to the technicolor dream of California. This journey was an act of desperation, a Hail Mary pass thrown by two men who refused to accept defeat. It was also an illegal crossing, as Bruce Palmer didn't have a work visa or a green card to enter the United States. He was entering the country as a ghost, undocumented and invisible, carrying the trauma of his failure in the back of a hearse. As they drove across the vast, flat expanse of America, Bruce Palmer sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape blur from snow to rain to desert dust. He was leaving behind his failure, but he was bringing the outsider mentality to the ultimate insider's club, Hollywood. He didn't know it yet, but he was driving toward the biggest traffic jam in history and a meeting that would change the sound of the 20th century. Los Angeles in 1966 was not merely a city, it was a shared hallucination experienced by millions of dreamers simultaneously. It was a neon-soaked, sun-drenched promise that whispered to every young person in America that they could be someone else, someone better, someone famous. The Sunset Strip was the center of this universe, a pulsating artery of asphalt, where folk singers were plugging into amplifiers and creating a new, dangerous sound that would soon conquer the world. Into this blinding kaleidoscope of color and noise rolled a stark black anomaly, a 1953 Pontiac hearse named Mort, carrying two desperate Canadian fugitives. Neil Young and Bruce Palmer arrived not as conquering heroes, but as exhausted refugees, driving a vehicle meant for the dead through a city obsessed with the living. They had driven thousands of miles on a wing and a prayer, fueled by a singular, almost delusional belief that they would find Stephen Stills amidst the chaos. They had met Stills briefly, years before, in the freezing clubs of Canada, and in their desperate minds, he had become a mythological figure, the key that would unlock the gates of Hollywood. He was the missing piece of the puzzle, the only other musician who understood the specific, strange frequency they were vibrating on. But Los Angeles is a sprawling, indifferent beast that swallows dreams whole, and for days they trawled the Sunset Strip, finding nothing but closed doors and empty pockets. They haunted the famous clubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go and Pandora's Box, searching the crowds for a familiar face, but finding only strangers who looked through them as if they were invisible. They were running out of money, running out of food, And most dangerously, they were running out of the manic hope that had propelled them across the continent. The reality of their situation began to set in with the crushing weight of a hangover. They were illegal immigrants in a hearse with no prospects and no friends. They made the painful decision to give up, pointing the nose of the hearse north toward San Francisco, hoping to find a softer landing in the burgeoning hippie scene there. They were leaving Los Angeles defeated, the dream over before it had even truly begun, ready to accept that they were just two more failures in a city built on broken promises. But the gods of rock and roll, who are often cruel but occasionally miraculous, intervened with a legendary twist of fate in the form of a traffic jam. It was a gridlock on Sunset Boulevard, the kind of stalling, choking traffic that usually signifies nothing but frustration and wasted time. This was the most famous traffic jam in the history of music, a moment of Jungian synchronicity that defies all logical explanation. Stuck in the gridlock, heading in the opposite direction, was a white convertible van carrying Stephen Stills and Richie Furay. They were bored, frustrated, and staring blankly at the cars inching past them, completely unaware that their destiny was sitting in the opposing lane. And then Stills saw it. The absurdity of a hearse in the middle of a sunny day, and then the impossibility of the Ontario license plates. It was a 1 in a million chance, a cosmic alignment that Stills recognized instantly because he knew only one person crazy enough to drive a hearse from Canada. He made an illegal U-turn right there in the middle of the strip, forcing his way through the angry traffic to chase down the black vehicle. He pulled up behind the hearse and honked, a desperate signal sent out into the void, hoping it would be received. Neil Young looked in the rearview mirror. Bruce Palmer looked out the back window, and the recognition was immediate and explosive. On the side of the road, amidst the exhaust fumes and the honking horns of angry commuters, 4 young men embraced on the asphalt. In that chaotic, loud instant, Buffalo Springfield was born, not in a boardroom or a recording studio, but in the middle of the street. They didn't need auditions, they didn't need to interview each other, and they didn't need a manager to tell them they had chemistry. They simply went to a house on Fountain Avenue, plugged in their instruments, and let the pent-up energy of their journeys explode into sound. The chemistry was instantaneous and terrifyingly good, a volatile mixture of personalities that should have clashed, but instead harmonized perfectly. You had the dueling guitars of Stills and Young, fire and ice, precision and chaos, and the soaring choir boy harmonies of Richie Furay. But underneath it all, holding this volatile mixture together and preventing it from flying apart, was the silent architect, Bruce Palmer. Critics have spent decades trying to analyze the Buffalo Springfield sound, dissecting the folk harmonies, the country twang, and the rock aggression. But musicians know the truth. The secret weapon was always the bass player who refused to play like a bass player. Bruce Palmer didn't approach the instrument like a rock musician, content to simply follow the root notes of the chords. He played it like an R&B player who had wandered into a folk band, treating the bass as a lead instrument in its own right. He played counter melodies, weaving complex melodic lines that danced around the guitars rather than just supporting them. He played with a circular, rolling groove that made the music swing, a technique he had mastered in the sweaty R&B clubs of Toronto. While Stills and Young fought for the spotlight with their egos and their amplifiers, Palmer stood in the shadows, anchoring the sound. He was the heartbeat, the earth beneath the sky, the gravity that kept the band's soaring ambitions from floating away into nothingness. Within weeks of their formation, they were the hottest band on the Strip, the house band at the Whiskey A Go Go, and the Kings of Los Angeles. They signed a record deal and released For What It's Worth, an anthem that defined the anti-war movement and the paranoia of the era. Bruce Palmer was 20 years old, he was a rock star, and he was living the life that millions of kids dreamed of. He was living in Laurel Canyon, the epicenter of cool, and dating the most beautiful women in California. He had money in his pocket, fame in his future, and the respect of the best musicians in the world. But he had momentarily forgotten the harsh lesson of Motown, that in the music industry, you are only safe until the very moment you become expendable. The year is 1967, and while the rest of the world was preparing for the summer of love, winter was coming for Bruce Palmer. Bruce had a secret, a vulnerability that made him a target in a city that was becoming increasingly hostile to long-haired musicians. He was a citizen of Canada living in the United States without a work visa, an alien in the eyes of the federal government. To the law, an alien who breaks the rules is not just a criminal. They are garbage to be thrown out, a contaminant to be removed. Bruce loved marijuana, which in 1967 was not a minor infraction, but a felony that sparked moral panic across the nation. The LAPD, famously hostile to the long-haired freaks on the Strip, were hunting for reasons to shut down the counterculture, and they found one in Bruce Palmer. They caught him in a raid, finding a small amount of plant matter that would be considered negligible today but was a nuclear bomb back then. The legal system didn't care that he was the bassist for one of the biggest bands in America, or that he was an artist. They didn't care about For What It's Worth or the cultural significance of Buffalo Springfield. They only saw an undesirable alien with drugs. In January 1967, at the absolute dizzying peak of his success, Bruce Palmer was deported back to Canada. Imagine the psychological devastation of that moment, the sheer violence of being ripped away from your dream, just as it becomes real. One day, you are on stage at the Whiskey A Go-Go, worshipped by thousands of screaming fans, a god in the pantheon of rock. The next day, you are on a plane back to Toronto, a failure, exiled from your own life and stripped of your identity. The band was thrown into immediate chaos, trying desperately to replace the unique feel that Bruce brought to the music. They hired session musicians and heavyweights, but nothing sounded right because the groove was gone and the soul was missing. Neil Young and Stephen Stills knew deep down that there was no Buffalo Springfield without Bruce Palmer, especially with the Monterey Pop Festival looming on the horizon. The band was a chemical equation, and without the bass player, the reaction simply didn't happen. The magic was inert. Bruce was stuck in Canada, trapped on the wrong side of the border, feeling desperate and angry at a world that kept punishing him for his success. He was watching his friends become legends without him, watching the train leave the station while he was shackled to the platform. In his desperation, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life, a choice that was both heroic and deeply tragic. He decided to break the law again, risking federal prison to return to the only thing that gave his life meaning. But to get back to his band, to get back to his art, Bruce Palmer had to commit a symbolic suicide. He had to kill his identity as a free-spirited artist and transform into the enemy. He went to a barber shop and sat in the chair, watching as the scissors cut through his long, beautiful rock star hair. He shaved his face, erasing the beard that marked him as a member of the counterculture. He went to a department store and bought a conservative business suit, a briefcase, and a pair of reading glasses he didn't need. He transformed himself into the man, the very establishment figure that his music was rebelling against. This was the disguise, a desperate camouflage designed to fool the customs officers at the border. He flew to the border and stood in line, sweating in that stiff, uncomfortable suit. terrified that his eyes would betray him. He lied to the officer, claiming to be a businessman on a trip, and miraculously, it worked. He crossed the border and was back in America, but something in him had died in that barber chair. He had sacrificed his true self to serve the machine of the music industry, trading his identity for a chance to play his bass. He returned to the band, but he was not the same man who had left. He was now a fugitive. He was an illegal alien, in the truest sense, a man who existed in the country only by the grace of a lie. Every time he stepped on stage, he was committing a crime. Every time he saw a police officer, his heart stopped. The paranoia that had started with the Motown bust now metastasized into a constant, overwhelming dread that colored every moment of his life. This explains the strange, haunting behavior seen in footage from this era, where Palmer often performs with his back turned to the audience. Fans thought he was being mysterious or cool, projecting their own fantasies onto his silence. They thought he was shy, or perhaps just eccentric, caught up in the music. But he wasn't being cool. He was hiding. He was terrified that in the crowd, amidst the screaming girls and the flashing cameras, there might be an immigration officer waiting to arrest him. He was terrified that someone would recognize him from the mugshot or see through his short hair to the fugitive beneath. He was a rock star playing to thousands of people, trying to be invisible, a paradox that tore him apart. He was a prisoner on the stage of his own glory, forced to perform while constantly looking over his shoulder. The pressure began to crack the foundation of his mind, turning his dream into a nightmare. To cope with the terror of his existence, to numb the feeling of being an imposter in a suit, Bruce turned to self-medication. The marijuana use increased, not for fun, but as a necessity to calm his shattered nerves. The drinking increased, becoming a way to drown out the constant fear of deportation. He became a spectral figure within his own group, physically present, but spiritually absent. He stopped doing interviews, stopped socializing, and built a wall around himself that no one could penetrate. The other members, Stills, Young, and Fure, were ambitious men who were writing hits and looking at the future. They didn't understand the hell Bruce was living in. They only saw the symptoms of his pain. They saw him as unreliable, stoned, and distant, a liability to their rising stardom. They didn't see a man who was risking federal prison every single night just to play the root notes of their songs. The tragic irony is suffocating. Bruce Palmer sacrificed his identity, his safety, and his peace of mind to keep Buffalo Springfield alive. And in return, the band began to view him as a problem to be solved, a broken part in their machine. He was the glue holding them together, but the solvent of paranoia was eating him alive from the inside out. By early 1968, the cracks were too wide to bridge, and the center could no longer hold. The paranoia was too loud, the drugs were too heavy, and the law was closing in again. The Wonder Kid from Toronto had become the problem child of Laurel Canyon, and the machine was getting ready to spit him out for the second and final time. Silence is the loudest sound in the world when the applause finally stops. It is a physical weight pressing down on the ears of a man who has spent years living inside a hurricane of noise. That silence is the terrifying sound of a rock star falling from the heavens back to the hard, unforgiving earth. It isn't a crash, and it isn't an explosion that makes the headlines of the morning papers. It is simply the sound of the telephone stopping its ring, leaving you alone in a room full of ghosts and empty bottles. For Bruce Palmer, the silence wasn't just the absence of music, it was the absence of identity. When the stage lights go out, the adrenaline fades, and the screaming fans go home to their normal lives, the musician is left with his own reflection. For a man like Bruce, whose entire self-worth was tied to the groove and the band, that reflection was a terrifying thing to face. He was a king without a kingdom, a soldier without a war, and a bassist without a beat. By May 1968, the magnificent engine of Buffalo Springfield had completely seized up, choked by its own ambition. The American Beatles, the band that was supposed to last 1,000 years and redefine American music, had lasted barely 2 turbulent years. The massive egos of Stephen Stills and Neil Young had grown too large for the room, suffocating the music they had created together. The recording sessions had turned into battlegrounds, where songs were used as weapons and silence was used as a shield. The drugs, once a tool for expanding consciousness, had turned the creative process into a paranoid battlefield of suspicion and isolation. Cocaine and heroin had replaced marijuana and LSD, hardening the vibes and turning friends into rivals. Bruce Palmer was the casualty left bleeding on the field, the collateral damage of a war between titans. He had given everything to the band, his safety, his legal status, his mental health, and in the end, the machine simply ground him up. When the band broke up, the other members had lifeboats ready to sail into golden futures. Neil Young launched a solo career that would eventually make him a god of rock, a singular voice of his generation. Stephen Stills and Richie Furay formed supergroups like Crosby, Stills and Nash and Poco, securing their futures with lucrative contracts and massive tours. They had plans, they had management, and they had a future that shone as bright as the California sun. Bruce Palmer had nothing but a deportation order, a heroin habit, and a suitcase full of dirty laundry. He was only 22 years old, a wonder kid who had aged a lifetime in a few short, chaotic years. He had touched the sun, flying higher than almost anyone from his generation, and now he was falling back to earth. He was burning up in the atmosphere of his own failure, disintegrating before he even hit the ground. There is a brief, agonizing moment in 1969, a what-if moment that haunts rock history and the mind of every Bruce Palmer fan. From the ashes of Buffalo Springfield, the ultimate supergroup was rising. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. This was the Woodstock lineup, the band that would define the next decade of music and become the voice of the counterculture. They needed a bassist to anchor their heavenly harmonies, someone who could hold down the rhythm while they soared. They didn't want a session player, they wanted family. They wanted the groove, so they called Bruce. Imagine the redemption that was within his grasp at that moment, the chance to rewrite the ending of his story. Imagine the total vindication of being invited back to the high table of rock royalty after being cast aside, to play Woodstock, to be part of the biggest band of the 1970s, would have erased the shame of the deportation and the pain of the breakup. Bruce showed up to the rehearsals, desperate to reclaim his place in the spotlight and prove he was still the master of the low end. For 2 weeks, the old magic flickered back to life, and the undeniable groove that had powered Buffalo Springfield was there in the room. When he locked in with the drums, the music lifted off the ground, and for a moment it seemed like everything would be okay. But while the musician was present, the man was not. A deep chemical fog had taken over his mind. He was erratic, showing up late or forgetting parts that he should have known by heart. He was distant, staring through his bandmates rather than looking at them, lost in a haze of narcotic detachment. He was vibrating on a frequency of paranoia that the others couldn't tune into, seeing threats where there were none. He believed cars were following him, that the phone lines were tapped, that the police were waiting outside the door. The other members of CSNY were dealing with their own egos and issues, but they were functional professionals who had a tour to book. They couldn't risk their $1 million empire on a man who might get arrested or disappear 10 minutes before showtime. They fired him again, replacing him with a session player named Greg Reeves, who would play the notes but never capture the feel. This was the final nail in the coffin of his ambition, the moment that broke his spirit for good. It confirmed the cruel lesson he learned with Motown, that talent is secondary to reliability. It proved to him that you are not an artist in the eyes of the industry. You are a spare part in a machine. If the part is broken or even just squeaking, you are swapped out without mercy and thrown in the scrap heap. Bruce walked away from the biggest opportunity of his life, carrying the weight of what could have been. When a musician breaks, they usually make a breakup album full of sad songs about love and loss, designed to elicit sympathy and sales. They try to write a hit single to prove to the world they still have talent and can survive on their own. They hire the best producers, polish the sound, and try to get back on the radio. Bruce Palmer didn't do that. He went into the studio to bleed onto the tape. In 1971, he walked into a recording booth to create his only solo album, a project that defied all commercial logic. He didn't want to write a hit song for the radio, and he didn't want to please a record executive. He wanted to record a scream that would last forever, a sonic document of his disintegration. The album is called The Cycle is Complete. If you listen to it today, it doesn't sound like 1971 folk rock at all. It sounds like it came from another planet. It doesn't sound like anything that should exist in the commercial world of verse, chorus, verse. It sounds like a nervous breakdown captured on magnetic tape, a raw feed from a mind in turmoil. It consists of 4 long, sprawling instrumental jams that refuse to resolve or offer any comfort to the listener. There are no hooks to hum along to, there are no choruses to sing, and there is no structure to hold on to. There is just a relentless, hypnotic, terrifying groove that pulls you down into the mud. It is a fusion of jazz, psychedelia, and pure silence, a sound that mimics the confusion of his daily life. It is the sound of a man trying to find his way out of a maze, only to realize the maze is inside his own head. Critics at the time didn't know what to do with such a bizarre creation, labeling it a disaster. They called it self-indulgent and messy because they didn't understand the language of trauma or the sound of a primal scream. They were looking for Bluebird or For What It's Worth, and instead, they got a sonic nightmare. They were missing the point entirely, viewing it through the lens of pop music rather than psychology. This wasn't an album for the fans, and it certainly wasn't an album for the charts. This was a medical record of a fractured mind, a therapeutic exercise that was never meant to be consumed like a product. It was Bruce Palmer saying, "This is what it feels like to be me right now." It was a suicide note written in bass lines and feedback. And who did he call to help him make this masterpiece of madness? He didn't call Stills or Young, the winners who had moved on to glory. He called the only other person who understood the specific pain of his past and the injustice of the industry. He called the other ghost of the Mina Birds, his old partner in crime. He called Rick James. Remember Rick, the deserter whose arrest destroyed their first dream and sent them fleeing to LA in a hearse? He was back in the picture, but he wasn't yet the super freak superstar of the 80s with the braids and the glitter. He was just Ricky, another lost soul drifting through the underground of Los Angeles looking for a break. He was hungry, he was crazy, and he was just as broken as Bruce. On the track Alpha Omega Apocalypse, you can hear Rick James losing his mind in real time. He isn't singing words or lyrics. He is scatting in wild, guttural noises that defy description. He is screaming, moaning, and whispering like a man possessed by demons that refuse to leave. It is a vocal performance that borders on the terrifying, a release of years of pent-up frustration and rage. It is the sound of two men, two former Motown prodigies, who were promised the world, locking themselves in a room and letting the darkness out. It is a seance where they summon the ghosts of what could have been and scream at them. They are mourning the death of the Mina birds, the death of Buffalo Springfield, and the death of their own innocence. The album sold nothing and vanished instantly from the shelves, becoming a rare artifact of failure. For Bruce, the title, "The Cycle is Complete," was a dark prophecy that he was writing for himself. He had started in obscurity, risen to the top of the world, and now he was back in obscurity. The cycle was closed, the journey was over, and the door was locked from the outside. The 1970s are often called the lost weekend of John Lennon, a brief period of excess and confusion. For Bruce Palmer, the 1970s were a lost decade that swallowed him whole and refused to spit him out. He didn't just retire from the music business in a dignified way, he evaporated from the earth. He became a rumor, a whisper, a question mark in the history books. He became a drifter in the truest sense of the word, untethered from any home or obligation. He moved between Los Angeles and Toronto, sleeping on couches, living in cheap motels, and crashing on floors. He stayed with friends until the welcome wore out, until his silence and his habits became too much to bear and he had to move on. He was a shark that had to keep moving to survive, but he was swimming in circles. The drug use shifted from the creative expansion of the 60s, where LSD opened doors, to the numbing survival of the 70s. Heroin and alcohol became constant companions, tools used to drown out the voices of regret and quiet the paranoia. He wasn't trying to find God anymore. He was trying to find oblivion. He was a ghost haunting the cities he used to conquer, walking past the venues he used to sell out. But the music industry is a machine of contracts and royalties that never stops turning, regardless of the artist's condition. Even if you disappear, the machine keeps printing money from your past work, churning out profits from the hits. Buffalo Springfield was still selling records. For what it's worth was still on the radio. And there were royalty checks waiting for Bruce Palmer, big ones. This is a detail that sounds like fiction, a plot point from a noir novel, but it is the cold, hard truth. His own lawyers, the men responsible for giving him his money, lost him completely. They sent letters to his last known addresses, but they were all returned to sender stamped "address unknown." They called old phone numbers, but they were all disconnected or belonged to strangers. They eventually had to hire private detectives to track down their own client, spending money to find the man they owed money to. Think about the absurdity of that situation. A rock star who is technically rich but living like a homeless person. A member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was a missing person file on a detective's desk. A man whose bass lines were playing on radios across America every single day could not be found by the people paying him. The detectives would track him down to a small apartment in Topanga Canyon or a damp basement in Toronto. They would knock on the door, and a gaunt, suspicious man would open it just a crack. They would say, "Mr. Palmer, we have money for you," and hand him a check for thousands of dollars. He would take the check, nod silently, and offer no explanation for his disappearance. And then a few months later, when the next check came due, he would vanish again. Why did he run from his own fortune? Why did he make it so hard to be paid? Because to be found was to be vulnerable. To have an address was to be on a list. To be on a list was to be a target for the immigration officers and the police. Bruce Palmer had learned that the only safe place was nowhere. The paranoia of the deportation had never left him. It had become his worldview. He believed that if he stayed in one place too long, The system would come to finish the job it started in 1967. During these lost years, the legend of the mysterious bassist began to grow among the fan base. Fans whispered about him in record stores and later on internet forums, trading theories like ghost stories. Was he dead? Was he in a mental institution? Was he living in an ashram in India? He was none of those things. The truth was far more mundane and far more tragic. He was just tired. He was exhausted by the weight of his own history. He was suffering from what we might now recognize as undiagnosed mental health struggles, likely exacerbated by years of chemical abuse. Years of substance abuse and the trauma of his public erasure had taken their toll on his psyche. He was a man who had been told by the universe over and over again that he didn't belong. So he simply stopped trying to belong. He accepted his status as an exile. He watched from the sidelines as his friends conquered the world without him, scaling heights he could only imagine. He watched Neil Young become the godfather of grunge, an icon who remained relevant in every decade. He watched Crosby, Stills, and Nash fill stadiums, their harmonies becoming the soundtrack of a generation. He watched Rick James become the king of funk, finally achieving the stardom they had chased together in the 60s. He watched them live the lives that were promised to him back in the Motown days. Did he feel bitterness? Did he throw things at the TV screen? Perhaps, but mostly, those who met him during this time describe a profound, detached gentleness. He wasn't angry, he was resigned. He was like a soldier who had come home from a war that no one else remembered fighting, carrying wounds that were invisible. But the music never leaves the blood. It is a virus that has no cure. The bass player can stop playing, he can sell his gear, he can hide in a basement, but he cannot stop hearing the low end in his head. He cannot stop tapping his foot when the rhythm is right. As the decade drew to a close and the excess of the 70s began to curdle into the plastic era of the 80s, the silence was broken. The phone rang one more time in a dark room. It wasn't a lawyer, and it wasn't a detective looking for a signature. It was the man with the black hearse. It was the voice from the past. It was Neil Young. And he had one question that would change everything. Do you still have the groove? The 1980s arrived not merely as a turn of the calendar, but as a sudden, bitter, cold front that froze the very soul of rock and roll. The warm, analog humanity of the 1960s, defined by tube amplifiers, the mud of Woodstock, and the communal dream of peace, was officially dead and buried under a synthetic layer of hairspray and commercialism. The organic grooves that Bruce Palmer lived for, the kind that sped up and slowed down with the beating of a human heart, were being ruthlessly replaced by the cold, unyielding precision of drum machines. Music was no longer about the feeling in the room or the connection between players. It was about the grid on the screen, the click track, and the synthesizer. The chaotic, beautiful noise of the counterculture had been sanitized and packaged for mass consumption, leaving no room for the glorious imperfections that made Buffalo Springfield so special. For a musician like Bruce Palmer, this new plastic world should have been a graveyard, a place where his specific set of intuitive skills was rendered obsolete. He was a relic from a time of smoke, sweat, and improvisation, a man who played by feel in an era that suddenly demanded mathematical accuracy and digital perfection. He was a dinosaur wandering through a new ice age of plastic and neon, drifting aimlessly through a Los Angeles that no longer recognized him or his contributions. The Sunset Strip, once his kingdom where he reigned supreme at the Whiskey A Go-Go, was now overrun by glam metal bands and corporate suits who didn't care about the pocket or the groove. He was a man out of time, carrying a history that the new generation was eager to forget in favor of the next big shiny thing. But Neil Young has always been a contrarian, a man who refuses to do the expected thing, even if it threatens to ruin his commercial career. In 1982, Neil did the most confusing thing in a career built on confusion. He fell in love with computers and the robotic sounds of the future. He began recording an album called Trans, a bizarre electronic experiment that was designed to alienate almost everyone who loved his acoustic folk music. He sang through a vocoder, turning his famous fragile, high lonesome voice into the cold, detached monotone of a machine, stripping away the very humanity that made him a star. To the outside world, it looked like madness, a deliberate act of career suicide by an artist who had lost his way. Critics hated the album, calling it a disaster and a betrayal, while fans were baffled by the change, demanding the return of the acoustic guitar and the denim jacket. But Neil knew a secret truth about machines, a truth born from his personal tragedy of trying to communicate with his nonverbal son, Ben, who responded to electronic sounds. He knew that for his computers to have a soul, they couldn't just run on binary code. They needed a human anchor to weigh them down to earth. He didn't want a perfect digital bass player who played strictly on the grid, because perfection is boring, predictable, and ultimately inhuman. He wanted the opposite of perfection. He wanted the dirt, the swing, the mistake, and the weight of history to counterbalance the technology. He wanted the ghost to haunt the machine. The phone call was short, unexpected, and completely devoid of the sentimentality or nostalgia you might expect from two old friends reconnecting. Neil Young didn't care about the rumors of madness, the whispers about heroin addiction, or the stories of Bruce wandering the streets of Toronto like a vagrant. He didn't care about the lost years, the deported status, or the army of private detectives who had failed to find Bruce in the past. He simply asked Bruce to come back to work, offering him a job and a purpose when no one else in the world would even return his calls. This was the lifeline Bruce had been waiting for in the dark, a sudden rope thrown into the abyss just as he was about to drown. But it was also a terrifying test of his remaining abilities, a challenge to see if the magic that had defined his youth was still there after years of neglect. He hadn't played on a major stage in over a decade, and the muscles in his hands were rusty from disuse and tremors. His confidence was shattered by years of isolation, by being told he was a criminal alien, and by the relentless chorus of his own internal demons. He packed his bass guitar, the only constant companion he had left in the world, and headed to the rehearsal studio to face his past. He arrived at the rehearsals for the Trans band looking like a time traveler who had taken a wrong turn at a wormhole. On one side, you had cutting-edge technology, synthetic voices, and a stage set that looked like the bridge of a sci-fi spaceship. On the other side, you had Bruce Palmer, looking like he had just walked out of a 1967 haze, wearing yesterday's clothes and a weary, haunted expression. The young technicians and roadies looked at him with skepticism, wondering what this burnout was doing in their high-tech laboratory. He was a glitch in their perfect system, a stain on their pristine white floor. But the moment he plugged his bass in and hit the first note, the paradox made perfect sense to everyone in the room. Bruce's bass lines didn't fight the machines. They humanized them, wrapping warm wooden tones around the cold, sharp digital spike. He played with a loose R and B swagger that cut through the icy production, adding a beating heart to the artificial body of the songs. He dragged the beat just slightly, creating a tension that made the robots swing and dance in a way no computer program could emulate. He was the ghost inside the shell, the necessary human error that made the art beautiful and relatable. For the first time in years, Bruce Palmer had a job, a steady paycheck, and most importantly, a purpose. He wasn't a fugitive hiding in a canyon anymore, and he wasn't a missing person file gathering dust on a detective's desk. He was a musician again, doing the only thing he was ever truly born to do, reclaiming his identity note by note. The tour was booked for Europe and America, promising to fill massive arenas with confused but fascinated fans who wanted to see what Neil Young was doing. It was a redemption arc that no one saw coming, least of all Bruce himself. For Bruce, standing on those massive stages must have felt like a hallucination, a sudden jarring shift from solitary confinement to the center of the Roman Colosseum. He was suddenly standing in front of 20,000 people every night, bathed in lights after years of silence and shadows. But if you look closely at the footage from this tour, you will see the trauma lingering in his body language, refusing to let him go. He is there, physically present on the stage, but psychologically, he is still hiding in plain sight. He refuses to step into the spotlight, treating it like a physical threat. He stands in the back, often hovering near the drummer, Ralph Molina, as if seeking protection behind the cymbal stands. He wears dark sunglasses indoors, shielding his eyes from the spotlight he learned to fear during the deportations of 1967. He plays flawlessly, locking in with the drums with telepathic precision, but there is a stiffness to his posture that speaks of deep, vibrating anxiety. He looks like a man holding his breath, waiting for the illusion to shatter and the nightmare to return. He is not performing. He is surviving the set. He is waiting for the immigration officers to storm the stage and drag him away in handcuffs in front of thousands of people. He is waiting for the deportation order to be served backstage, ending his life in America once and for all. He is waiting for the inevitable collapse, convinced by history that every moment of peace is simply a trap waiting to spring. He was clean for the tour, or as clean as a rocker in the 80s could possibly be, because he knew this was his last chance to exist. He held on to this opportunity with a grip of desperation. Neil Young ran a tight ship, demanding absolute professionalism from his crew, and Bruce respected that enough to keep his demons at bay for the duration of the tour. He showed up on time, he played the notes perfectly, and he didn't cause scenes or embarrass the band. But off stage, the profound isolation returned immediately, wrapping around him like a cold, wet blanket. While the rest of the band celebrated the tour, going to dinners and parties in European capitals, Bruce would retreat to his hotel room. He would lock the door and disappear until lobby call the next morning. The years of being a missing person had hardwired his brain for solitude. He no longer knew how to be around people without feeling an intense primal fear. He was a public star for 2 hours a night, adored by thousands of screaming strangers who didn't know his name. He was a hermit for the other 22 hours, invisible to everyone, eating room service alone. He lived in the space between the applause and the silence, a purgatory of his own making that he couldn't escape. The tour was a temporary reprieve, not a cure for his loneliness. The tour ended in 1983, as all tours must, dissolving like smoke in the wind and leaving only memories. And just as quickly as the door to the castle had opened, it slammed shut again, locking him out of the kingdom. That is the cruelty of the session musician's life. You are family while the music plays, and a stranger the moment it stops. When the tour ends, the payroll stops immediately, the per diem cash dries up, and the camaraderie evaporates. You are left standing on the curb with your suitcase. The phone stops ringing, and the friends move on to the next city, the next project, the next life, leaving you behind. Neil Young moved on to his next obsession, a rockabilly album called Everybody's Rockin'. which required a completely different aesthetic. He didn't need an R&B bassist for that sound. He needed a stand-up bass player with slicked back hair and tattoos. Bruce Palmer was released back into the wild without a safety net, dismissed like a temporary employee whose contract had expired. He was disposable once again. He returned to the shadows, but this time, the shadows were darker and colder than before because he had tasted the light again. He was now in his late 30s, and the Wonder Kid label was long gone, replaced by the stigma of being a has-been. The money from the tour didn't last forever, eaten up by old debts and the high cost of living in Los Angeles. The 1980s and early 90s became a blur of obscurity, a long, slow fade out into nothingness. He was becoming a ghost while he was still alive. He played small clubs for pocket money, backing local bands that weren't fit to tune his guitar just to feel the vibration of the stage. He jammed with local musicians who couldn't believe the Bruce Palmer was standing in their rehearsal space, treating him like a museum exhibit come to life. He became a piece of living folklore in Los Angeles, a ghost story told by musicians over drinks at the Rainbow Bar and Grill. I saw Bruce Palmer at a bar in Topanga, they would say, as if spotting Bigfoot. I saw Bruce Palmer walking down the street in Toronto. He was drifting again, untethered from the world, a ship without an anchor in a storm. The anchor had lost its ship, and he was floating aimlessly through the decades. Then, in 1997, the industry that had chewed him up, spit him out, and forgotten him decided to say thank you. Buffalo Springfield was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was a call from the past that demanded an answer. It was the ultimate validation for any musician, the gold stamp of approval from the establishment that had once rejected him. It was the history books officially opening to write his name in permanent ink, ensuring he would not be forgotten by time. Bruce had to go. He had no choice but to accept the honor. He had to step into the light one last time to accept the apology of the industry that had ruined his life. But the man who walked onto that stage in Cleveland shocked everyone who remembered the golden, cool boy of 1966. He looked frail and terribly thin, his clothes hanging off him like they belonged to someone else. He looked like a ghost made of cigarette smoke and bad memories, shivering under the bright lights. He was only 50 years old, but he looked 70, aged by a life lived in the fast lane and the dark alley. He was a visible map of trauma. His suit hung loosely on his skeletal frame, a stark contrast to the tailored perfection of his youth when he was a fashion icon. His face was gaunt, carved deep by decades of stress, substance abuse, and poverty. The crushing weight of paranoia had left its mark on his skin, turning him gray and weary. While the other members gave polished speeches, thanking managers and wives, Bruce stood silently at the back. He looked out at the crowd of millionaires and industry executives, the gatekeepers of the business, who were now applauding him. These were the same suits who had banned him, deported him, and erased him from the narrative 30 years ago. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and shaky, barely registering on the microphone. He didn't talk about his genius or his contributions to the Buffalo Springfield sound. He didn't talk about the hits or the good times. He didn't try to rewrite history. He made a joke, a deflection, a shield to protect himself from the sincerity of the moment. He deflected the praise because he didn't know how to receive it after so many years of rejection. He was visibly uncomfortable in the spotlight, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a man waiting for a bus. You could see it in his eyes. He didn't feel like he belonged in the Hall of Fame, but then they picked up the instruments and the talking stopped and the awkwardness evaporated. For 3 minutes, the years melted away. The pain vanished and the Hall of Fame disappeared. Bruce Palmer closed his eyes and leaned into the neck of the bass, his hands finding the familiar shapes, and he laid down that pulse. Boom, da boom, boom, da boom. It was the heartbeat returning to the body. It was the sound of 1966 all over again, fresh and dangerous and alive. It was the sound of the Sunset Strip when it was still wild and full of promise. It was the sound of a miracle happening on live television, a resurrection of the dead right before our eyes. For those few minutes, he wasn't the deportee, he wasn't the addict, and he wasn't the ghost. He was the king. He put down the bass, his job done, his point proven. He walked off stage and vanished for the last time, slipping away before the lights came up. He didn't stay for the after parties to mingle with the stars and drink champagne with his old friends. He didn't launch a comeback tour or sign a book deal to tell his side of the story. He knew the truth deep down, a truth the others didn't want to see or acknowledge. He knew that this was a funeral for his career, not a rebirth. He packed his bags quietly, folding his one suit. He looked at the country that had seduced him and destroyed him one last time. There was no comeback tour. Bruce Palmer simply crossed the border, not as a fugitive in a disguise, but as an old man going home. He was done fighting gravity. He didn't return to the bustling energy of Toronto, the city where he had been a wonder kid. He went to Belleville, Ontario. It was a quiet, modest town buried in the winter snow. It was a place where rock stars go to become human beings again. Belleville is not Laurel Canyon. There are no groupies waiting at the stage door here. There are no drug dealers on speed dial. There is just the weather and the silence. For the last few years of his life, Bruce Palmer lived in total obscurity. To his neighbors, he wasn't the legendary bassist of Buffalo Springfield. He wasn't the man who jammed with Eric Clapton. He was just the quiet guy down the street who looked like he had lived a hard life. He played music occasionally, but only for the love of it. He would jam with local musicians in small, empty clubs. Imagine the scene in those dive bars, young kids playing cover songs, completely unaware of the man in the corner. They didn't know the frail man holding the bass was a giant. He never corrected them. He never bragged about his past. He let the mystery consume the man, offering no corrections to those who didn't know his name, but the body keeps the score. His health began to fail rapidly. The years of self-medication began to collect their heavy debt. The alcohol and the drugs he used to numb the paranoia had done their work. His heart, the literal and metaphorical engine of his life, was growing tired. There is a profound sadness in these final years. He was separated from the friends who defined his youth. Neil Young was still filling arenas around the world. Stephen Stills was a living legend giving interviews. Bruce Palmer was alone in a cold climate, watching the snowfall. He had spent his entire adult life trying to escape Canada. He had viewed it as a prison, a place of failure. And now, the circle had closed completely. The prophecy of his solo album, The Cycle is Complete, had manifested in the physical world. He was back where he started, but he wasn't the same man. He was a survivor of a war that was fought in the shadows. The end came quietly. There was no rock and roll death, no tragic overdose in a hotel room, no fiery plane crash. On October 1st, 2004, Bruce Palmer suffered a heart attack. He passed away in Belleville. He was 58 years old. 58 is too young to die. But for a man who had lived 1,000 lifetimes of stress, fear, and chemical chaos, his body was much older. The news traveled slowly through the grapevine. It didn't stop the presses like the death of John Lennon. It was a small obituary in the back of the music papers. Bassist for Buffalo Springfield dies. That was the headline. Neil Young heard the news. Stephen Stills heard the news. They paused in their busy lives. They remembered the black hearse. They remembered the traffic jam on Sunset Boulevard. They remembered the groove that changed the world. And then the world kept spinning. The machine kept moving. Why does Bruce Palmer matter? He matters because he is the truth behind the myth. Rock and roll loves to sell us the dream of ultimate freedom. It sells us the image of the rebel who conquers the world. But Bruce Palmer shows us the true cost of that rebellion. He was a genius who was broken by the very industry that needed him. He was a man who gave us the heartbeat of the 1960s, but lost his own rhythm in the process. He matters because he represents every artist who was too fragile for the spotlight, every musician who stood in the back, doing the heavy lifting while the frontmen took the bows. History tried to erase him. It deported him. It blurred his face in the photos. It lost his royalty checks. But listen to the low end. You can ban the man. You can deport the body. You can break the mind, but you cannot deport the groove. Bruce Palmer is gone. The ghost has finally left the machine. But as long as the music plays, the heartbeat remains.